Classicism was probably the first truly international aesthetic movement, if you like. The coming about at its earliest high point around the 5th century BC in Greece. And at the time, Greece was seen as the culture to emulate. And so eventually when the Romans started ascending to power, they were borrowing from the Greeks. And then, of course, the Romans spread that right around the Mediterranean. And eventually, time passed, Rome fell, the empire fell apart, and things began to take on more of an individual flavour in the former provinces of the empire. And of course, people were still interested in what they saw as the authoritative artistic style, which was Classicism. And so they tried to emulate it, and they tried to keep it going, and particularly in terms of architecture and the arts, more successfully in literature. But of course, with a lot of the basic knowledge had been lost. A lot of the engineering knowledge had been lost. And by the medieval period, people weren't really necessarily wanting to do what the Romans did. They were putting their own spin on things. They weren't actually necessarily trying to get this incredibly idealized look. And there were little revivals here and there. But it wasn't until the Renaissance, and so at least the end of the 1300s, the beginning of the 1400s really, that artists and writers and architects were looking not only at what the Romans had written down about what the Romans thought they were doing, and then getting some very funny ideas based on maybe a single book that survived, that might have actually been quite idiosyncratic, and making their own interpretations. And it wasn't until maybe 100 years later they start trawling around the old ruins and measuring them out in a sort of a systematic way. And then in 100 years after that, you get more of a sense of a kind of what we'd call archaeology today, but it didn't really exist as a science then. It was more sort of hobbyists running around, artists in particular, copying sculptures from the collections of aristocrats and of course the Vatican, and recording these and learning from them, and actually studying them rather than making it up as they went along. And this was all seen as a revival of the high culture of the ancient world, moving away from a God-centered universe as such, back to a more human-centered universe. And this, of course, was the Renaissance, which comes from the French for rebirth, Renaissance. So it was a rebirth of culture, a rebirth of that civilized order, a desire to emulate the great successes and powers and sophistication of the Roman world particularly. Greece had kind of fallen out of consciousness by that stage. They knew there was obviously Plato and Aristotle and bits and pieces that survived mainly through Roman authors. Interestingly enough, it was the Muslim world that preserved a lot of the Greek texts, because they were very much interested in the more practical side of Greek philosophy and medicine in particular, and engineering and the sciences. So they preserved a lot of these texts in their libraries, and because they had largely had access to the Greek world still through Byzantium, and later, which became Constantinople, which became eventually Istanbul. So they had direct access to the texts. They also had Greek speakers who could also mostly Greek Christians, who could translate these texts into Arabic, and eventually they get sort of translated back into the West, and that helps kickstart a lot of activity.